Everyone, my name is Carol Culhane. I'm a professional home economist. I am a certified food scientist. I operate a company called International Food Focus, which I've had since 1993, and we specialize in regulatory compliance. I'd like to very much thank Emily Murphy of ACHES for inviting me to prepare this presentation for your conference, for the ACHES conference. And what I have entitled this talk to be is a select history of food. There are probably many histories of food, and probably none of them are definitive. So what I have done is select the occurrences throughout time, which I think have had a major impact on the food supply today. In this introductory slide, you see right in the middle, computer-generated art, and I include this. Well, it's not a photo, little picture in a lot of my presentations. And when I was near the end of drafting, I thought throughout the presentation, I put together juxtaposition, the old, the original, the ancient, and today's application of that particular phenomenon. And I thought this looks like the giant causeway in Northern Ireland. So to the immediate left is a ancient picture, let's say, of the giant causeway. You see those columns on the left, and they are the result of volcanic activity millions of years ago. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see that people are exploring them. So I even put that juxtaposition in the first slide. The topics I'd like to review with you today include the quest for food, milling of local grains, trade and food fraud, bacterial cultures and fermentation, slow cooking, and the preservation of food. So the quest for food, we're going to talk about the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, well, humans. And maybe you're thinking, maybe rolling your eyes thinking, this is going to be boring. What I want to emphasize is that every single person on this earth at this point in time, the billions of us, are descendants of people who survived times whenever there was next to no food, next to no homes, next to no water. And that is, we're here today because of that instinct of survival. Excuse me. Some of my interest in this particular topic is because one of my hobbies is Celtic history. So I know a little bit about the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic humans. So and if we think of Paleolithic, that's the oldest. Neolithic, think of the word new, that's the most recent. Mesolithic in the middle. So Paleolithic, most sources say they existed 3.3 million, 250,000 years ago. That is debatable. A lot of the ages or times in eras that are associated with these particular generations are very Eurocentric. Other parts of the world, humans were developing at different paces. And this is something we know now. So the boundaries are fluid. But I have then taken the most often quoted, and that's the Eurocentric times. So to get food, first we have to think, well, how did the people realize you had to slaughter an animal to eat? Somehow they figured this out. But the tools that they had were chopping, hammering, rock chipping, to make spears, cleaving, and controlled use of fire. This is extremely important, controlled use of fire, that they could cook food and it would make it more palatable. That's something they discovered, a lot of trial and error. Flake tools, the chipping of stones, of bone, and to make a desired shape. Maybe some people listening to this might remember the cartoon series, The Flintstones. That comes from a dense rock of flint. Then sophistication came in, such as the use of an axe from bone, ivory, or anthers, spearfishing using barbed poles, and needles. I'll talk more about needles. Now, how they found needles, these needles would be from a bone, and there would be a hole, of course, in one area of this particular filament, and they would then sharpen the end of it to make a needle. So food sources were birds, animals, grasses, fruit, vegetables, kale, nuts and seeds. I mentioned kale because kale is a historic vegetable. Thousands of years on from this time in the Middle Ages, kale was one of the major sources of nutrients for Europeans living during the Middle Ages. So Mesolithic, thinking middle. So flake tools, chipping of stones of bone and stone to desired shape, cutting and splitting from dense rocks such as flint. Use of rough edges to act as a serrated edge. Think of a serrated knife. That's what we use for bread and tomatoes today. Well, Paleolithic people figure that out. Scrapers and blades. And down in the bottom right-hand corner, 60,000 years ago in Northern Australia, a first known use of stones to grind food. So this came up in my research for this presentation. So this is this ancient mortar and pestle. So what the people would need to find is two stones, one with a cavity, some kind of a hole, and then something else then to grind whatever it might be. It might be grains, it might be vegetables, to some kind of a powder. And what we're realizing here is the surface area. People knew if they could increase the surface area of the grains, might be dried meat, it might be vegetables, if they could prepare it more easily. And surface area is a big part of food science today. So this is what the Mesolithic people were up to. And the left-hand top picture there, this might be something that you might consider to be an axe. So then Neolithic, and we're still in the Neolithic, 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, and more sophistication, axe from bone, ivory or antlers, resharpening tools. We know that they were then using one tool instead of just discarding it, finding a way to sharpen it. Spearfishing using barbed poles, again, harpoon, and needles from bone to make nets and tattoos. There is a fabulous museum in Montreal called the Montreal Museum of Archaeology and History. And I had the chance to visit an exhibit there in 2014 when I was there for a conference. And they isolated the fact that the needle is one of the very, very few instruments which hasn't changed in modern times from its first discovery and use in hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million years ago. So I have a picture here on the right-hand side of needles. So needles, then they could start putting together pouches to carry food. They could start sewing different pieces of hide together. And if they were able then to find a bone with marrow, they would hollow up the barrel, put ink in there, and that's how they started to make pictures, and using the needle or the hollowed out bone as a sort of a paintbrush. So they could break down carcasses into smaller pieces, gather many fish or birds using nets, and then these nets that they could also intertwine and create using needles. And in the bottom right-hand picture there, I have an article from the British Museum. Now, also part of the Neolithic age is what they call the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age. And this is very important when we think of its applications today and the discovery and use of copper. Copper is a very highly conducive metal. Think of chefs that might have copper-based pots and pans because the copper is very conductive. But it also, during this time, the Bronze Age, a soft metal that could be molded and shaped. And this is the beginning of pots and pans as we know them today. And smelting of metals into sophisticated tools and armor, for example, horseshoes, cooking vessels, farming equipment, including that used on beasts of burden. So also in 3000 BCE in Europe was the invention of the stone mill to grind grain. I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. But this brought about also the centralized agriculture in communities because they could make pots and pans. They could start putting farms together. And I have a picture here of this prehistoric original hut or village. And you can imagine maybe some of the conversations that people were having, saying, well, why are you building this? There's no food around here. There are no animals. We're still going to have to run whatever, how many miles to find animals. What this tells us is this was the beginning of civilizations in terms of cities and villages and communities. And there was enough confidence for the people who built these particular huts that they could have a food supply nearby. If they didn't have that confidence, they would not have built these particular villages. And so I also have here from this particular time, a Roman oyster fork. There is an excavation near Hadrian's Wall in the UK, and it is a Roman fort whenever the Romans were living in Britain. And it was discovered about, I think, 20 years ago, and there's a major excavation. going on. So I had the chance to visit Vindolanda when I was there in 2018. And it's amazing, the pots and pans that they had. And this is an oyster fort. The Romans loved oysters. So there we are. It's something about maybe 200, 300 AD. And people are using oyster forks. There's also letters, for example, this one wife of a general was inviting people to her son's birthday party and preparing food for the birthday party. So they were these sort of occasions where food was important to celebrate. So the quest for food, food insecurity, hunting for food and eating local. When I came across this particular picture on the left-hand side, I thought, wow, there's a central food source and people are rushing to this slaughtered animal so that they can prepare it to eat. And I juxtaposed that with this actual picture. This is St. Luke's food bank. It's only about 2 blocks away from my office here. This is only 1 block. It turns around the corner on the left-hand side and goes the other direction. Every Tuesday and Thursday, there are people lined up for 2 blocks to get food from the food bank. And when I was looking at this, I thought some of this hasn't changed. People today are hunting for food. They're looking for local sources of food. Many people of a community are going to one particular place to get food. And we know that the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic way of hunting food and getting food has been the precursor to the food supplies we know today. And so the question that I have to leave with you is, what impact are these food banks going to have on our supply in the future and the way that we secure food for people who have food insecurity? So true or false, Paleolithic, you might hear a lot of Paleolithic diet. And when I just want to groan, I say no. The fact that you might be eating nuts and seeds and vegetables and fruits, they aren't the same as they were millions of years ago. Things have changed, even without any genetic modification. A lot of plants are just going to be changing to the environment around them. So in my regulatory compliance, I remember one particular company, I advised them not to say anything about paleo whenever I shared some of this very information with them. I said, no, I don't think you can make that claim and then be able to say that it's true. So the archetypal milling of grain. When I was first studying home economics back in the 70s, I came to the realization that civilization all over the world, communities found a grain and they found a way to mill that grain, yet they didn't have contact with each other. And I find that fascinating, that no matter where on the planet a particular community lived, they would find a grain and eventually find a way to mill it. And this I also think is very instinctive. And it tells us a lot about the human psyche and intellect and how it can be applied to the quest for food. So on the bottom of the screen here, I have a bit of the progression of milling. There's that 60,000-year-old mortar and pestle, let's say from, I'll call it that, from Australia. The second one to the left, this is from early Egypt, where they are using human labor to turn the stones. And the way that the mill works is there'll be 2 stones, one on top of the other, and the one on top moves and rotates on the bottom one, which is stationary. But just like they say here, the stone doesn't crumble while the grain is being milled, even after years of milling. So that is the mechanics behind grain milling. The third, you had stone mill factories. There's one which is a bit of a museum piece, I understand, in Finland. The lady in the middle with the mauve shirt, this is from China. And here she is milling corn. And she's walking herself. The one man second in from the right, this is that particular, they call themselves Biostone Mill in Vermont, I think it is. And you can take your hand and try milling the grain yourself with that stone on the top, and then a cross section of mill stones. And that's the way milling plants are today in facilities. There isn't much difference. I had the chance to tour an oat milling facility in Oregon back in 2009. And it's a high facility that uses gravity and vacuums to be pushing the oats from one part of the facility to the other and grinding them to a particular specification. So what I have here, what I pulled together is what we know about the first grains that were discovered by humans, and then how they developed over the years. So this is the introductory slide, and we will see the same slide at the end as we go from the first point in time whenever we know a particular grain was domesticated, let's say. So the first that we have is rice. It's first domesticated in the Yangtze River Basin in China, 13,500 to 8,200 years ago. And that's the oldest. And then it's followed by wheat. Now, wheat, they say, originated what's called a fertile crescent. And that's a very important part of the evolution of humans. See that W for wheat just underneath it. It is the eastern crescent of the Mediterranean Sea. And that's what they call the Fertile Crescent, because a lot of civilization originated there and developed there. So that eastern horseshoe, and also even the name Mediterranean tells us a bit of the people's concept of the earth at that time. Meta meaning middle, Terranean earth. So they felt that that part of the world, that was the middle of the earth. They knew there was something north, something south, but it would be a while before the Atlantic Ocean was navigated. Anyway, wheat was first grown 1,200 years ago. Then corn. Corn is native to tropical America, but first cultivated in Mexico 10,000 years ago. And you can see this pattern that the people living in these regions found a grain, figured out how to mill it. Then millet. It's actually a grass and very important in India, but also in Africa, as is corn, which is maize, teff, and sorghum. And then oats. So oats were introduced to the British Isles by the Romans about AD 43. And it was in the British Isles that it really flourished. They found that it could grow under harsh conditions. And when we think of oats, we don't think of the Romans, we more or less think of the Scots, who are well known for their inclusion of oats in their diet. So, this is our final slide. So what we can see is all over the globe, communities, different nations recognize grain as a food source, found a way to mill it. And what do we have today? So this is 2023 metric tonnage of produced grains. And we see corn at the top. And corn was the third that we know of to be domesticated, preceded by rice and wheat. So there's wheat, milled rice, barley, sorghum, oats, and rye. And what I think the question I would leave with you is, why do you think corn leads? It's in the first place by about 50% of wheat in the second place. What I can say is corn is very versatile. We have cornstarch, we have cornmeal, that sort of adhesive that used to be in Scotch tape, that was corn-based. But also, if we taste these, corn is the sweetest of corn, wheat, and rice. And those three particular grains, I understand, account for about 60% of all of the plants consumed on Earth, the corn, the wheat, and the rice. And the sweetness of the corn, that's where we get corn syrup. So corn lends itself very well to isolation of different parts of its plant, and well used. So there's something that you can pursue if you wish to. Then the Silk Road and the spice trade. Okay, so this is the Silk Road, and there's Silk Road 1 and Silk Road 2. And I'm bringing this into this presentation because this was the beginning of the trade of spices. Before this, in Europe and the British Isles, a lot of flavoring would have come from herbs and perhaps different flowers, edible flowers, but not a lot of spices. The spices were coming from the Orient, Asiatic area of the world. So there's a Silk Road 1. It's not a road, it's not a single route, it's an area. rugged terrain from China to the eastern Mediterranean sea coast, that Fertile Crescent, and then the products were shipped westward from there. And the term really refers to a network of routes. And the first one lasted about 1,500 years, from 130 BC to 1453 AD, whenever the Han Dynasty of China closed the Ottoman Empire for trade with the West. Anyway, Marco Polo, very, very influential. So he was a explorer, pioneer. He loved to travel. And it was in the 13th and 14th centuries that he decided to revive, if he could, the Silk Road. And he did it under the Mongols. And he used the Silk Road to travel to what was then called Cathay. And there's a little ditty. My brother in his grade 8 history class, they were introduced to this. And I remember him coming home and singing a little ditty, and it went like this: Marco Polo went to Mongolo. He went to Cathay and had his first bathe. So any child that heard that, you would remember Marco Polo. And so China was called Cathay. It's pretty well, I think, understood, but maybe some disputed that he introduced, then passed it to the Italians. Think of wontons. And that was the Chinese using wontons. We think of pastas belonging to the Italians. But the beginning of a very lucrative spice trade that would last for centuries. But not only spices, but oils, perfumes, pottery, cooking vessels, non-food items, such as, again, the silks and textiles, gems, also flowers. There's a lovely book called The Rose Grower, and different hybrids of roses would come through to France from travel from the Orient, but also culture and religious influences. Now, some things never change. Spices have, over the centuries, been the source of food fraud. They could be diluted with dust, maybe sand, whoever it might be. So this was a lot of the beginning of food regulations that we have here in North America, where we would set standards for the purity of a lot of foods, but including spices. And here's a relevant application today. This is a problem in the States. This has been going on since November of 2022, so about 16 months now, where there was contamination of cinnamon in applesauce pouches, and the contamination is heavy metals, lead and chromium. And there is a standard for cinnamon in the US, like there is in Canada, and there is next to no provision for the inclusion of heavy metals. Now, I want to mention here, there are a lot of people who want natural food, like natural colors. Natural is going to come from the earth, and from that is going to come heavy metals, which are cadmium, arsenic, lead, mercury, and here we have chromium. There has been a concern for a while now for the level of arsenic in rice grown in the US, that arsenic is coming from the soil. So they've been tracking this down, both the FDA and the CDC, that is the Center for Disease Control, and finding who is responsible. They're still tracking this down, and we see that it has been the result of some sickness. And the median age is 1 year old, because people will be giving applesauce to their little ones because it's easy for them to consume. So also it's not determined if this is a deliberate contamination or someone is just not aware of what the regulations are. So as I was saying, some things never change. Bacterial cultures and fermentation. So I'm going to then provide you with two particular examples, bacterial culture and then a fermentation. I went to France for the month of 2002 to study French in the south, in Montpellier. And during the weekends, they would take us out on particular trips to see some of the culture, some of the beautiful little historic medieval villages. But they took us to a particular facility, a little town where it was the beginning of the finding of Roquefort cheese. And that, yes, this is the story that this particular young shepherd, he had his lunch of bread and like a used milk cheese. It was like a soft cheese, and left it behind in a cave. Here they say he saw a beautiful girl in the distance and left it for quite a while. So maybe he married her, we don't know. But he returned a few months later and found this Roquefort cheese. In the story that we were introduced to, whenever this first happened, the people believed it was divine intervention. They would fall down on their knees and pray that this particular cheese and then would be converted into Roquefort. But it is because of a bacterial culture, this fungus, Penicillium roqueforti, was widespread in nature. It can be isolated from soil, became organic matter and plants. So that's one example of how humans were first discovering that food will change, and they can perhaps control that change. Then the fermentation of beer. The production of beer is first recorded in 3000 BC, now Iraq, and popularized in Europe in monasteries and abbeys, bit of hit and miss and trial and error. So there was a student of Louis Pasteur, he's the father, commonly called the father of fermentation, whose father was a beer master, and having trouble getting his particular lots or vats of beer to be as predictable and of the quality that he wanted. And Louis Pasteur jumped in and said, oh, I think I can help with that, and helped the father then define particular strains of the culture for the fermentation to make the beer making more predictable. That mention of Louis Pasteur, he's also the father of pasteurization of milk. And I have to mention here Adelaide Hoodless, who comes from, she lived in Stony Creek. And she was the first person to put together women's institutes, which then became all over the world, women institutes. And it was at some point in time in the early part of the 20th century where pasteurization of milk in certain Ontario was not mandatory. And she, with the Women's Institute, made it mandatory because of the ill effects of unpasteurized milk. It can be a source of tuberculosis, and it can just also then other contaminants. So we can thank Adelaide Hoodless for pasteurization of milk, certainly in Ontario. Now, the current application, precision fermentation, here is a quote from Cicero in Australia. Precision fermentation involves engineering a microbial like a yeast or a fungi to produce an animal protein or fat with the same texture, taste, and nutrition as the original. So since the 1980s, precision fermentation has been used extensively to produce a high range of high-value pharmaceuticals and vitamins and fortified foods. This is using fermentation sort of as a little factory. For example, they will use a very inert form of E. coli to make thousands and thousands of molecules of chymosin, which is the equivalent of rennet to curdle milk, but chymosin is the scientific one. And they use the E. coli as a little bit of a factory, wash the E. coli off, and they're left with their chymosin. So they have developed that now. This is then the cell-cultured meat. This is a little picture of the first cell-cultured hamburger, first developed in 2012 by a Dr. Post at a university in Holland. I forget the name of the university right now. His name is Mark Post, at a very, very high cost. It was first approved in Singapore, November 2020. That's because Singapore imports about 90% of its food supply. They see this as a food security issue. So they see this particular way of producing meat as a way for them to address food insecurity. And in 2022, the USA's FDA approved 2 cell-cultured meats, and they maintain a lit inventory of the cell-cultured meats that they have approved. The biggest challenge right now with cell-cultured meats is cost. It's extremely expensive, and so they need volume to be able to bring down the unit cost. Okay, slow cooking and soil as an insulator. So I first heard of whole baked beans when I was reading a local newspaper up at my parents' cottage in the Ottawa Valley. And north of there, they would have a traditional festival every fall. And one of the foods that they love to prepare and serve are beans baked in a hole in the soil. So I did a little bit of research for this particular presentation, and found that in the lumber camps of Maine, this hole baked beans was a staple. And there was a study done of the nutritious aspects of this particular aspect of the diet by the University of Maine. And most of those lumbermen were Canadian men in their 20s. I see my font is a little bit off there. Yeah, in their 20s. It doesn't mean to be larger. I just see it right now, it's larger. So whole baked beans is something that people apply quite a bit. So there's even a recipe in the New York Times of how you can make your own bean hole in your backyard or wherever it is, and then put in this vessel. It would have to be a metal vessel and cover it very carefully so that sand doesn't get in it. You put it into the, get your coals very hot. You get them sort of cinder hot, because you are going to be covering them, so there will not be the oxygen to keep a fire going. And then you put your beans in this pot. They will have been soaked a bit. Cover it, put it in there, cover it with some soil, and leave it for about 8 hours. So people who think slow cooking or the slow cooker is a modern invention, I would put forth that it's not. I would like to know more about using the soil as a vessel for retaining heat and using that to bake. I don't know if this practice in North America came from the Aboriginals, or did the European people bring it with them? I don't know. I haven't been able to find that, but that could be somebody's research project. And then the preservation of food. We could have a whole course of preservation of food, but typically what we're trying to do is to control temperature. It will grow at that particular range. That needs a food source, if there's any of these mold, fungi, viruses, bacteria, water, and depending on the species, oxygen or not oxygen required. So the way I wanted to speak about this today was to give some examples of each of these preservation techniques and look at the old and the current. So freezing, of course, we have the ice box and its comparison to modern day freezers. And I know the Danes used ice quite a bit to freeze, and they would have a vessel, a big hole in the ground, have it lined, put ice in there, and they could pretty well keep it from one winter season to the next, and use that particular area to at least freeze, well, at least keep food cold, perhaps freeze it. But that's how the ice box, a really true ice box. And then these particular microbials that we want to then avoid, they need a food source. We can't remove the food source. It's food that we want to protect, but we can remove the bacterial viral agent through thorough cleansing and sanitation. Now, available water, I have there a footnote, the notation for water activity. You want to remove available water. And this appears to be the most common method of preservation in, let's say, the 19th and 20th century. We know about the addition of salt, cod, and pickling. We know about the addition of sugar, jams and jellies, and dehydration. The Aboriginal people dried salmon and dried fruit. They made pemmican, which was this mixture of perhaps a few grains, but dried meat and dried fruit. But smoke also can remove available water. You want to get that available water removed so that the bacterial agents can't get at it, the molds, etc. It's believed that the phenols in smoke is what is effective there, but also the would-be drying from the particular fire. But I have a picture up here on the left-hand side of salmon, and that can be wind-dried or smoke-dried. And the Fraser Valley, I was watching a documentary on TVO not long ago. This tradition continues today. And this picture could have been taken yesterday, let's say. Well, not yesterday, it's winter up there, but let's say last summer. So that's common. Then oxygen, removal of oxygen through the creation and maintenance of a vacuum seal. And that's the basis of home canning in the canning industry. Modern application is sous vide. Burial in soil, again, you will be removing some oxygen, and smoke. There, I'm repeating that, but phenols are the preservation agent. And the removal of water and oxygen by adding ingredients low in pH, as the vinegar, lemon, lime juice, etc. You're creating a film where the oxygen can't get at the food. That's how we then stop the browning of, let's say, bananas and apples. But also then you're decreasing the available hydrogen. that would not be available to whichever microbial fungi mold that it is that you want to control. Bottom left-hand side, this is your modern, sustainable, eco-friendly fridge. You can see quite a few of those on the internet. You would need an electrical source. There's a handle going down to a stairway, but it's much more economical to operate a fridge below soil than it is above the land. And that also is the basis of food cellars from times past. But I do know some people who are getting their homes custom built want a food cellar in their basement. So what's old is neither new again or not so old. And for my summary, I have here in 2024, thousands of humans are hunting for food in a quest for food due to food insecurity. And what eventual lasting impact will this current phenomenon have on communities across the globe? We know from the cultivation and milling of grains that humans have an instinctive ability to discover local food sources and make the food palatable. And this continues to fascinate me, how we've seen this all over the globe through the evolution of man. And trade has resulted in a global diversified source of grains. Again, I had to cut this short at one particular point in time, but trade then allows us a diversified source of grains, which then adds diversity to our diets, which then brings us a wider range of nutrients. And humans have an instinctive desire to travel and trade, just like Marco Polo, but this has resulted in the ethnicity of the food supply in all parts of the world. And again, this is, I think, a way of securing the nutrient diversity of our food supply, where we aren't relying on any one source for key nutrients. Food fraud is still prevalent. You would think with all this technology that there's less, but no, it's just a lot like money fraud, banking fraud. The bankers will tell you the people who do this are extremely bright. It's too bad they don't put their skills to use and help make the money supply more safe. But the bankers are always trying to have to outsmart the people who want to crack into your bank account. Same with food fraud. You would think with all of the detection that we have, all of the tools for detection, that there'd be less food fraud. I'm sorry to say there appears to be more. And the foods which are most prey to food fraud are those which are common, orange juice, or easy to mimic, like olive oil. Olive oil is traded in high volumes, but also it has been easy to mimic. And there are some steps in place to see if they can come up with a molecular standard for olive oil that then can earlier detect fraud. So bacterial culturation and fermentation is now a precise food processing mechanism. However, every newfound strain is naturally occurring. It's going to be out there someplace, and they'll find it on something and walk into the lab. I know people said this to me, and boo, where's that coming from? And then we know we have ways now where we can then, isolate it and retain it. Will and can cultivated meat live up to its expectations? It is a very expensive way of making meat. Food preservation began in the Paleolithic era with the use of controlled fire, where they would then be able to dry things. And copper is as precious today as during the Bronze Age. And yes, there is an underground market for copper. So some things never change. So in references, I have here a number of references. The Montreal Archaeology History Complex, you might want to visit that sometime. Spice and Herb Frauds, that was published in 2023. Millstone Grinding, Grain is Sensitive Life. Stone Grinding Mills for Grain and Pulses, that's biostonemill.com. You can go there, it's a place in the States, and practice milling grains with your hands. There's Louis Pasteur. His work now is being applied, of course, to yeasts. Singapore, the first regulatory approval of lab-grown meat. Food history. So this is a UK's essay, Food Nutrition History 2018, but like many of these things, as soon as they're published, they become a bit dated. This is a fascinating place, the Canadian Agriculture and Food Museum, the History of Food Preservation. You can go to that museum. It's on the agriculture farm in Ottawa on Carling Street. It's free. I visited it in 2014. It's absolutely fascinating. And they have a lot of exhibits which show how, for example, soil was used to preserve food. There's a history of food fraud from Thermo Fisher. They make instruments that work for the detection of food fraud. You want to learn more about Marco Polo, there's the reference, the history and processes of milling, again, the resilience of man. And is the paleo diet a lie? The earliest European cities were mostly vegetarian. That's true. That's the cities were vegetarian because they were in the cities. They weren't out hunting and looking for elk, deer, horse, whatever it may be. And there's a little bit about me. If you'd like to contact me, oh, I don't have my contact information. I'll give my contact information to Emily while she has it. So that's my presentation. I've enjoyed putting this together. I've enjoyed working with Emily. I learned a lot, and the questions that I thought I'd answered just generate more questions for me. They say that's a sign of good research. So I wish you a very successful and happy and productive conference, and all the best as Brescia College continues in its relationship with Western.